Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us. And today, we're tackling a topic that sounds deceptively simple.
Deceptively simple is a great way to put it.
Yeah, chopping wood, carrying water.
Mm,
We hear these phrases and we think, yeah, okay, got it. Sounds pretty basic.
right, like chores.
Exactly. But the more I've been reading about this, the more I'm realizing there's this whole other layer of like philosophical, historical, even spiritual meaning baked into these everyday tasks.
It's true. And it's interesting how these ideas resonate so strongly today, especially when we think about, like you said, our modern world where everything's so fast-paced and technology-driven.
Right. It's like this weird paradox.
Cultivate.
We're surrounded by all this convenience, all this technology, but there's this longing to reconnect with something more fundamental, something tangible.
Yeah, and maybe even something that makes us feel more grounded, more present.
100%.
Mm.
So I thought maybe we could start by like taking a step back, looking at the historical side of things.
Okay, so
Like when we talk about chopping wood, for example, for our ancestors, that wasn't just like a weekend chore, you know? It was essential to their survival.
absolutely. I mean, think about it. Warmth cooking, building shelter, it all depended on having a supply of wood. And what's fascinating is that every culture, out of necessity, developed its own unique approaches to getting that wood.
It's like this universal human need.
Right. Like we all needed it, but how we got it, that's where the ingenuity of the cultural differences, the traditions all come in.
Okay, so let's dig into that a bit because it wasn't just about brute strength, right? Like you were saying, there was real skill involved in choosing the right tools, knowing how to work with the wood itself.
Oh, absolutely. It's a craft.
Yeah.
It's like imagine looking at a tree and understanding its grain, its density, knowing exactly how it would split based on years of like passed down knowledge.
Wow.
That's what our ancestors were doing. They weren't just swinging an axe haphazardly.
So there's an art to it.
100%.
It's almost like a carpenter who can see the finished piece of furniture within a simple block of wood.
Exactly. It's about understanding the material, respecting the process, and having the skill to transform something raw and natural into something useful.
Yeah.
And, as you get into that rhythm of chopping, something really interesting happens.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. I
Yeah.
think it becomes almost meditative, right?
You're completely absorbed in the moment. Each swing, the sound, the feeling, uh, quiets the mind in a way that few other activities can. And on top of that, it's a phenomenal workout.
It's like a moving meditation.
I like that.
Okay, so we've chopped our wood. Let's move on to carrying water, which, let's be real, without water, there's no life as we know it.
No, there's not.
Yeah.
And just like with chopping wood, carrying water wasn't as simple as turning on a faucet.
Mhm.
It was an entire process from finding safe sources to transporting it efficiently and making sure it didn't spill everywhere.
You know, I was trying to picture this earlier. If we had to carry all the water we use in a single day, the sheer volume of it, talk about a reality check on how much we take for granted.
It's mind-boggling when you really think about it. And imagine the knowledge involved, understanding where to find clean water, the best vessels for carrying it, how to store it to prevent spoilage. There was real skill in all of that.
Okay, I'm starting to see a theme here. Chopping wood, carrying water. They seem like such simple tasks, but they require a surprising amount of knowledge, skill, and even, dare I say, mindfulness.
Precisely. Think about the focus it takes to carry a heavy container of water without spilling a drop, or the steady rhythm of walking back and forth to the source. Your mind has to be present.
You're so right. It's like in those moments, your mind has no choice but to be present. You can't be lost in your thoughts when you're focused on balancing on your movements, on literally carrying this essential resource.
And that's where the magic happens. In a world that's constantly pulling us in a million directions, those simple, repetitive tasks become almost meditative. They force us to slow down, to be present in our bodies, and to appreciate the things we so often take for granted.
It's like they offer this natural antidote to the chaos of modern life.
Exactly. And it's not just about the individual experience either. These tasks often involve a communal aspect, which brings us to another fascinating dimension of this whole concept.
So we've been talking about chopping wood and carrying water as these like individual tasks.
Right.
But you're right, there's this whole other layer of community that we haven't really touched on yet. And I think that's a really important piece of this whole puzzle.
It is. It's easy to forget in our, individualistic society. But for most of human history, these tasks were often shared endeavors. People worked together to gather wood, to bring water to the community. It wasn't just about fending for yourself, it was about the collective survival.
It's like that African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child.
I love that.
Maybe it takes a village to chop wood and carry water too.
Right. Because it really was a collective effort.
Mm.
And it fostered this sense of interdependence.
Mm.
People understood that their survival depended on each other, on everyone doing their part.
And there's something really beautiful about that, you know? It's like those tasks help to build stronger bonds within the community. They created a sense of shared purpose, a sense of belonging.
Absolutely. And, even today, we see remnants of this in our own lives, those moments when people come together to help each other out.
Like when neighbors come together to help after a storm or when people volunteer at a community garden. Those are great examples.
Exactly. Even in our modern world, those opportunities to connect with others, to contribute to something larger than ourselves, they're still there.
Hmm.
And they can be incredibly fulfilling. They can bring us back to that sense of community that maybe we've been missing.
It's like that human need for connection, for belonging. It never really goes away, does it? And
Yeah,
maybe tapping into that, even in small ways, can bring some of that simplicity and meaning back into our lives.
I think so. I think you're onto something there. It's not about going back in time. It's about finding those points of connection, even amidst the busyness of our modern world. And, speaking of finding rhythm and connection in unexpected places, I think it's worth talking about nature for a bit.
Okay, love this. Because we've been talking about the rhythms of chopping wood and carrying water, but nature has its own rhythms too, the seasons being the most obvious example.
Right.
So how does that tie into everything we've been discussing? How can we learn from these natural rhythms and maybe apply them to our own lives?
Well, let's start with spring. It's a time of renewal, new beginnings. Everything comes back to life after the quiet of winter. It's like hitting the reset button.
It's like nature's giving us permission to start fresh.
Exactly. And just like we plant seeds in the garden in spring, we can also plant seeds of intention in our own lives.
Yeah.
What do we want to cultivate in the coming months? What steps can we take to move towards our goals?
That's a great analogy. So spring is about new beginnings. What about summer?
Summer is all about growth and abundance. It's a time to really enjoy the fruits of our labor.
This is making me think of my grandma's garden. It was always just bursting with life in the summer.
There you go. It's about slowing down, paying attention, and appreciating the abundance around us.
Mhm. And then, of course, summer eventually gives way to autumn, which for me is all about transition. The days get shorter, the leaves change color, and there's this sense of things winding down, preparing for winter.
And just like nature lets go, it's also a time for us to reflect on what we might need to release from our own lives.
You know, it's funny how we instinctively know this. Like, even if we're not consciously thinking about it, something about autumn makes us want to declutter, to simplify, to shed those things that feel heavy or unnecessary.
It's like it's hardwired into us, this connection to the natural world and its cycles.
It really is. Okay, so we've gone from spring's fresh start to summer's abundance to autumn's letting go, and now we're at winter, which honestly can be a tough one for a lot of people. How do we find that same sense of simplicity and meaning during the colder, darker months?
But the winter often gets a bad rap, but it's just as important as the other seasons. It's a time for rest, reflection, and going inward.
It's like nature is telling us to slow down, recharge, and conserve our energy.
Exactly. The world around us is quieter, more still, and it invites us to do the same. It's a time to embrace those cozy rituals, to connect with loved ones, and to nourish ourselves on a deeper level.
I love that. It's about finding those sources of warmth and light, both literally and figuratively, during a time when those things can feel scarce.
You've got it. Winter is a time to embrace those things that bring us comfort and joy, whether it's curling up with a good book, spending time with loved ones, or simply allowing ourselves to rest and recharge.
It's like we're gathering our energy for the new cycle that's to come.
Precisely. Because just as spring always follows winter, a time for new beginnings always follows a period of rest and reflection.
This has been such an eye-opening way to look at the seasons, not just as something we go through, but as this incredible source of wisdom and guidance for how to live our lives.
And, it's not just about the seasons themselves. It's about recognizing those same rhythms within ourselves.
Okay, what does that look like? What do you mean by that? So we were talking about how we can notice these natural rhythms in ourselves, just like the seasons.
Right, like our own personal seasons.
Exactly. So what does that actually look like? I mean, how do we apply that to our daily lives?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that just like spring and summer are times of growth and expansion, there are going to be times in our lives when we're just naturally more outwardly focused, more energized, ready to take on new challenges.
Makes sense.
But then, just like autumn and winter are times of slowing down and turning inward, we also need those periods of rest and reflection in our own lives.
Mm,
And it's okay to honor those times.
I can definitely relate to that. You know, there are times when I'm just like firing on all cylinders. I'm tackling a million things at once. But then there are other times, and I'm sure our listeners can relate to this too, where I just need to hit the pause button and recharge my batteries. It's like my body's telling me to slow down.
And it's so important to listen to those cues
Mm.
because if we ignore them for too long, we end up feeling burned out, exhausted, just completely out of balance.
Okay, so that makes sense, like on a theoretical level. But how do we actually do that? How do we know when it's time to push forward and when it's time to rest? I mean, is there like a magic formula?
I wish there was a magic formula, but unfortunately, it's not always that simple.
Mm.
I think it really starts with self-awareness, just paying attention to our energy levels, how we're feeling physically, emotionally, mentally, noticing those subtle signs that our bodies are giving us.
So like tuning in.
Exactly. Tuning in. And then once we're aware of those cues, we have to give ourselves permission to honor them, even if it means saying no to things we might normally say yes to or taking a step back from our usual routines.
So it's really about giving ourselves the same grace and compassion that we extend to nature, right? Like recognizing that those cycles of growth and rest, they're both essential parts of the journey.
Exactly. And sometimes it's in those quieter moments, those times of reflection and introspection, that we actually gain the most clarity and insights. Like we need that space to process, to integrate, to really connect with our inner wisdom.
So much of what we've been talking about today comes back to that idea of mindfulness, doesn't it?
Hmm.
It's not just about chopping wood and carrying water literally, but also figuratively. It's about bringing that same sense of intention, that same awareness to everything we do.
You've got it. It's about being fully present in each moment,
Yeah.
whether we're washing the dishes or having conversation with a loved one or even just taking a walk in nature.
Yeah, like savoring those little moments, the simple pleasures that we often rush through or take for granted.
Exactly. Because those are the moments that make up our lives.
Yeah.
And when we bring our full attention to them, they become so much richer, so much more meaningful.
You know, this whole conversation has been a great reminder that simplicity isn't about deprivation or doing without. It's really about making those conscious choices that create more space for the things that truly matter to us.
I love that. It's about stripping away the excess, the distractions, all the noise of modern life to uncover those essential elements that make life worth living.
Absolutely. And those elements, they often show up in the simplest of things, like taking the time to cook a meal from scratch, or spending an afternoon in nature, or having a meaningful conversation with someone we care about.
Beautifully said. It's about finding the extraordinary in the ordinary, the sacred in the everyday.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of this whole chopping wood, carrying water idea.
I agree, there's so much depth to explore here.
And we hope our listeners feel inspired to do just that.
Keep exploring, keep connecting, and keep seeking out those moments of simplicity and wonder in your everyday lives.
That's a great place to wrap up, I think. To everyone listening out there, thanks for joining us on another deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.
See you next time.